Imagine this. You're cruising through life feeling like you've got it all figured out. The job's steady, the bills are paid, and maybe you've even got a weekend getaway planned. Then, out of nowhere, the bottom drops out. Your boss calls you into the office and says, "We're letting you go." Or maybe your partner sits you down and says, "I don't think this is working anymore." Or worse, something you never saw coming, like a health scare or a natural disaster, rips through your world like a tornado through a trailer park. Everything you thought was solid, gone. Poof. Just like that. It's the kind of moment that stops you dead in your tracks. Your chest tightens, your mind races, and all you can think is, why me? What did I do to deserve this? You're not alone in feeling that way. Life has a habit of throwing curveballs when we least expect it, and it doesn't care if you're ready to catch them. Take Jake, for example. Jake was a regular guy, 32 years old, living in a small apartment in Denver, Colorado. He worked as a mechanic, loved his pickup truck, and had a girlfriend named Sarah who he thought might be the one. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. Then, in the span of a single month, it all unraveled. The auto shop he worked at shut down after the owner went bankrupt. Sarah packed her bags and left, saying she needed space to find herself. And to top it off, a pipe burst in his apartment, flooding everything he owned, his couch, his clothes, even the old guitar he'd been meaning to learn how to play. Jake sat on the curb outside his waterlogged home staring at the mess and thought, "This is it, I'm done. There's no coming back from this." He felt like the universe had singled him out for a cosmic beatdown. Maybe you've been there too, sitting in the wreckage of your own life, wondering how you're supposed to keep going when everything's fallen apart. But here's the thing. That moment, as brutal as it feels, isn't the end. It's the beginning. And that's where Stoicism comes in, not as some dusty philosophy from ancient Rome, but as a real practical lifeline for when the world turns upside down. Because the truth is, you can't control the storms that hit you, but you can control how you stand up in the middle of them. The Stoics, guys like Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, knew a thing or two about chaos. Marcus was an emperor dealing with wars, plagues, and betrayal. Seneca faced exile and a death sentence. Epictetus? He started life as a slave. These weren't ivory tower thinkers sipping wine and daydreaming about the meaning of life. They were in the trenches, just like Jake, just like you and me. And they figured out something powerful. When everything falls apart, the only thing that matters is what you do next. So let's walk with Jake for a bit. Let's see how he went from that curb, surrounded by soggy ruins, to a place where he could breathe again, maybe even smile. Because this isn't just his story, it's yours too. It's about what happens when the worst hits, and how you can build yourself up, one steady step at a time. The day after the flood, Jake woke up on a friend's couch, his back stiff and his mind still spinning. He hadn't slept much, just stared at the ceiling, replaying every disaster in his head. If I'd saved more money, I could have handled the shop closing. If I'd been a better boyfriend, Sarah wouldn't have left. If I'd checked that pipe, the if-onlys piled up like bricks and he felt crushed under them. That's when his buddy Mike, who'd let him crash there, walked in with 2 cups of coffee. Mike wasn't the philosophical type. He was a welder with a beard like a Viking and a laugh that could wake up a coma patient. But he said something that stuck with Jake. "Man, you're beating yourself up over stuff you can't change. What's done is done. What are you gonna do about it now?" Mike didn't know it, but he'd just dropped a Stoic bomb. Epictetus, one of those old Roman thinkers, said it best. There is only one way to happiness, and that is to cease worrying about things which are beyond the power of our will. In plain English, stop stressing about what you can't control. The shop closing, not Jake's fault. Sarah leaving, her choice, not his. The flood, a freak accident. Jake sipped his coffee and let that sink in. It didn't fix everything. His bank account was still empty, and his apartment still smelled like a swamp, but it shifted something in his head. For the first time in days, he stopped looking backward and started looking at what was right in front of him. See, Stoicism isn't about pretending bad stuff doesn't happen. It's not toxic positivity or slapping a fake smile on your face. It's about facing reality head on and asking, okay, this sucks. Now what? Jake couldn't undo the past, but he could decide what to do today. And that's where the rebuilding starts, not with a hammer and nails, but with a choice. He grabbed a notebook from Mike's cluttered coffee table and wrote down what he could control. Finding a new job, cleaning up his place, figuring out where to crash until it was livable again. It wasn't a grand plan to take over the world, it was small, practical stuff. But it was a start. And in Stoicism, that's everything. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Jake was beginning to see that strength wasn't about fighting the whole world. It was about mastering his own thoughts. Jake's notebook became his lifeline over the next few days. It wasn't fancy, just a beat-up spiral thing with coffee stains on the cover, but it gave him something to hold on to. He'd scribbled down those first steps. Find a job, clean the apartment, figure out a place to stay. Simple, right? But when he actually started doing them, it felt like climbing a mountain with a backpack full of rocks. First up, the job hunt. Jake hit the pavement, walking into every auto shop within a 10-mile radius of Mike's place. Most of them said the same thing. "Sorry, man, we're not hiring." One guy even laughed and said, "You're the third mechanic this week asking." By the end of day one, Jake's boots were worn, his ego was bruised, and he was back on Mike's couch with nothing to show for it. That night, he almost gave up. He stared at the ceiling again, thinking, "What's the point? Nobody wants me. I'm washed up." But then he remembered something he'd heard once, maybe on a podcast or from some random guy at the bar, about how the Stoics didn't run from hard stuff. They leaned into it. Seneca, that Roman philosopher who'd been through hell himself, wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body." In other words, the grind wasn't just something to survive, it was something to use. So Jake flipped his thinking. Instead of seeing every no as a rejection, he started seeing it as a test. How many doors can I knock on before I break, he asked himself. Day 2, he was back at more shops, more no's, but he kept going. By day 3, he landed a gig. It wasn't glamorous, just part-time at a tire shop, changing flats and balancing wheels, but it was a paycheck. And more than that, it was proof he could push through. Next came the apartment. Mike drove him over with a couple of trash bags and a mop. The place was a disaster: soggy carpet, warped furniture, and a smell like a gym locker room after a rainstorm. Jake wanted to turn around and leave, but he thought about Marcus Aurelius again, how that guy ran an empire while dealing with worse messes than this. Marcus wrote, "What need is there to weep over parts of life? The whole of it calls for tears." Jake chuckled at that one. If life was going to be tough anyway, why waste energy complaining about a little water damage? He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Hours of scrubbing, hauling, and sweating later, the place wasn't perfect, but it was livable. He even salvaged that old guitar, propping it against the wall like a trophy. Step by step, the chaos started to feel less overwhelming. That's the Stoic trick. You don't fix everything at once. You focus on what's in front of you, and you do it without whining. Jake wasn't some superhero, he was just a guy with a mop and a stubborn streak. But that's all it took to start building himself back up. A week into his new routine, Jake hit another wallone he didn't see coming. It wasn't the job or the apartment this time. It was people. Mike's girlfriend, Lisa, stopped by one night and saw Jake crashed on the couch. She didn't say much, but her raised eyebrow and tight smile said it all. "What's this loser still doing here?" Then there was the text from Sarah out of the blue, just a picture of her hiking with some new guy, no caption. Jake's old boss even called, not to offer work, but to vent about how the shop's collapse was everyone else's fault. Suddenly, Jake's head was full of noise. Lisa thought he was a mooch. Sarah was moving on without him. His boss was a reminder of everything he'd lost. He felt small, judged, stuck, like no matter what he did, it wasn't enough for the world. That's when he stumbled across another Stoic gem, this time from Epictetus. You become what you give your attention to. If you yourself don't choose what thoughts and images you expose yourself to, someone else will. Jake realized he'd been letting everyone else's opinions rent space in his brain. Lisa's smirk, Sarah's photo, his bosses whining they were dragging him down, and he was the one handing them the keys. So he made a call, let it go. He couldn't control what Lisa thought. Maybe she'd warm up, maybe she wouldn't. Sarah's life? Not his business anymore. His boss? Just a voice on the phone he didn't need to answer. Jake grabbed that notebook again and wrote one word. Me. From now on, he'd focus on what he could do, not what others expected. It wasn't easy. The next time Lisa came over, he caught that look again and his stomach twisted. But he took a breath, nodded hello, and kept eating his dinner. When Sarah posted another cryptic update, he scrolled past it. Little by little, the noise faded, and in its place, quiet. Space to think, room to grow. A couple of weeks into his new gig at the tire shop, Jake started to feel a rhythm. Wake up, brew some cheap coffee, head to work, clock in, change tires, clock out. It wasn't the dream job he'd imagined back when he was fixing engines and dreaming of opening his own shop one day. But it paid the bills barely and kept him off Mike's couch. He'd even moved back into his apartment, now mostly dry and smelling less like a swamp. Still, something gnawed at him. Every night he'd sit on his salvaged couch, staring at that guitar against the wall and think, is this it? Is this all I've got left? The big plans he'd had, building a life with Sarah, saving up for a house, maybe starting a family, felt like they belonged to someone else now. Without them, he wasn't sure what he was even working for. One slow afternoon at the shop, while he was balancing a wheel, an older guy named Ray rolled in. Ray was a regular, drove a beat-up Ford pickup and always tipped a couple bucks, even though Jake told him it wasn't necessary. Ray caught Jake zoning out and asked, "You all right, kid? You look like you're a million miles away." Jake shrugged. "Just wondering what the point is, you know? Used to have all these ideas about where I'd be. Now I'm just here." Ray chuckled, leaning against the counter. "You think I plan to be a retired welder driving this rust bucket? Life's what happens while you're making plans. But you're still breathing, right? That's something." That stuck with Jake. Later that night, he dug into some Stoic wisdom he'd found online, turns out. Ray was onto something Marcus Aurelius had nailed centuries ago. Concentrate every minute like a Roman, like a Manon doing what's in front of you with precise and genuine seriousness, tenderly, willingly, with justice, and on freeing yourself from all other distractions. In simpler terms, do the small stuff well and let the big picture figure itself out. Jake decided to try it. The next day at work, he didn't just change tires, he focused on doing it right, tightening every lug nut like it mattered, wiping down the rims, chatting with customers instead of grunting at them. It wasn't world-changing, but it felt good. Like he was building something, even if it was just a stack of well-balanced wheels. At home, he picked up that guitar. He didn't know a single chord, but he spent an hour plucking strings, laughing at how bad he sounded. It wasn't about becoming a rock star, it was about showing up for himself. Little by little, those small actions started to fill the empty space where his old dreams used to be. Purpose didn't have to be some grand, shiny thing. It could be as simple as a clean tire, or a terrible G chord. Just when Jake thought he was getting his footing, life threw another punch. It was a Thursday, about a month into his tire shop gig, when his landlord knocked on the door. "Rent's going up next month," the guy said, handing Jake a notice. "Market's hot, can't keep it this low." The new number? $200 more than he was paying, money Jake didn't have. He shut the door, sat down, and felt that old panic creeping back. The math didn't add up. His part-time paycheck barely covered food, gas, and the current rent. 200 extra? Might as well have been 2 million. He thought about calling Mike, maybe crashing there again, but he'd already leaned on that lifeline too much. For a minute, he let himself spiral. "I can't catch a break. Every time I get ahead, something knocks me back." But then he caught himself. That wasn't the Stoic way. Seneca had a line for moments like this. "What need is there to anticipate misfortune? The time to mourn is when it arrives." Jake wasn't evicted yet. The rent hike was a month away. Panicking now wouldn't fix it. It'd just waste the time. He had to figure things out, so he grabbed his notebook again. Step 1. Look for more hours at the shop. Step 2. See if he could pick up side gigs, maybe oil changes or handyman stuff on weekends. Step 3. Cut costs where he could. No more takeout, no more streaming subscriptions he barely used. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a plan. And having it written down made the problem feel less like a monster and more like something he could wrestle with. The next day, he talked to his boss at the tire shop. "Any chance I could go full-time?" he asked. The guy scratched his head. "Not right now, but we've got a busy season coming. Stick around, prove yourself, and we'll..." See, it wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Jake took it as a win. Then he posted a flyer at the local coffee shop. Mechanic for higher cheap rates, reliable work. By the end of the week, he'd landed 2 small jobs, enough to cover half the rent increase. It wasn't solved, but it was progress, and that's what Stoicism kept teaching him. You don't have to win every battle in one swing, you just have to keep swinging. A few weeks after the rent hike news, Jake hit a quiet patch. The tire shop was slow. His side gigs were picking up, but not fast enough, and he had too much time to think. One rainy Saturday, he was stuck inside, the patter of drops on his window, matching the restless drumbeat in his head. He'd been grinding, pushing forward, but that question kept creeping back. Is this really enough? He caught his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror bags under his eyes. Stubble he hadn't bothered to shave, a guy who looked tired but not broken. Staring at himself, he started replaying the last few months. The shop closing, Sarah leaving, the flood, the job hunt, the rent mess. It was a highlight reel of disasters, but for the first time, he didn't feel crushed by it. He felt different. That's when he thought about something Epictetus said. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Jake leaned against the sink and let that sink in. 6 months ago, losing his job would have sent him into a tailspin of beer and self-pity. Sarah walking out would have had him texting her non-stop, begging for answers. The flood? He'd have probably just moved to Mike's permanently and called it quits. But now, he was still standing. Not just surviving standing. He grabbed his notebook and flipped through it. Pages of scratched-out plans, little victories, messy notes about jobs and budgets. It wasn't pretty, but it was his. Every step he'd taken, every no he'd turned into a keep going was proof he wasn't the same guy who'd sat on that curb ready to give up. The Stoics had a word for this: eudaimonia. It's a fancy Greek term that basically means living. Well, not because life's perfect, but because you've made yourself strong enough to handle it. Jake didn't know the word, but he felt it. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, and he still couldn't play that guitar worth a damn. But he was tougher mentally, at least. And that toughness wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, like the rain outside, steady and unshakable. The next Monday, a new guy started at the tire shop, Carlos, a wiry dude with a quick smile and a habit of whistling while he worked. Jake liked him right away. Carlos was younger, maybe 25, but he had this energy, like he'd already figured out how to roll with life's punches. During a lunch break, they got to talking over sandwiches in the break room. "So, how'd you end up here?" Jake asked, nodding at the greasy shop around them. Carlos grinned. "Long story. Grew up in a rough spot, dad split. Mom worked 3 jobs, got into some dumb stuff as a kid. Did a year in juvie, came out, decided I was done screwing around. Been bouncing between jobs since, but I'm good now." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem like the type to let that weigh you down." "Nah," Carlos said, taking a bite of his sandwich. "What's the point? Past is past. I can't fix it, so I just keep moving. My mom always said, you don't get to pick the cards, but you play them anyway." Jake smirked. "Sounds like something a Roman emperor might have said." Carlos laughed. "What, like Caesar? I ain't that fancy. Just common sense." But Jake knew better. Carlos was living a Stoic truth, without even knowing it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The art of living is more like wrestling than dancing, because an artful life requires being prepared to meet and withstand sudden and unexpected attacks." Carlos had wrestled his way through a messy past and come out swinging, not bitter, not broken, just moving forward. Watching Carlos whistle his way back to work, Jake felt a spark. If this kid could shrug off a childhood like that and still show up with a grin, what was Jake's excuse? The rent hike, the breakup, the flood, they were tough, sure, but they weren't the end of the world. Carlos was a walking reminder. You don't have to be a philosopher to live like one. You just have to keep playing the cards you're dealt. That night, Jake picked up the guitar again. He still sucked, but he played anyway, loud, off-key, and grinning like an idiot. It wasn't about mastering it. It was about showing up. About 2 months after Carlos started at the tire shop, Jake was starting to feel like he'd turned a corner. The rent hike was still looming, but he'd scraped together enough from side gigs to cover it for now. Work was steady, he'd learned. A few chords on the guitar badly, but still, and he was sleeping through the night without that knot in his chest. Life wasn't perfect, but it was manageable. Then the call came. It was a Tuesday evening, and Jake was microwaving a frozen burrito. When his phone buzzed, it was Mike. "Hey man," Mike said, his voice tight. "You sitting down?" They found my brother. Mike's younger brother, Danny, had been missing for years, lost to addiction, bouncing between rehab and the streets. Jake had met him a couple of times back in the day, funny kid, always cracking jokes until the drugs took over. Mike had been searching for him on and off, but the trail had gone cold. Until now. "He's gone," Mike said. "Overdose. Found him in some flop house downtown. I don't know what to do, man." Jake's stomach dropped. He mumbled something about being sorry, hung up and stood there, the burrito forgotten. Mike was his rock, the guy who'd given him a couch, a coffee, a kick in the pants when he needed. And now Mike was the one falling apart, and Jake didn't know how to fix it. The next day he went to Mike's place. Mike was a mess-rid-eyed, pacing, muttering about how he should have done more, found Danny sooner. Jake tried to help, offering to handle the funeral stuff, but Mike waved him off. "I just need to be alone," he said, and shut the door. Driving home, Jake felt helpless. This wasn't a flooded apartment or a job hunt. They couldn't mop this up, or write it in his notebook. It was bigger, heavier, and it shook him. That night he sat on his couch staring at the wall, and the old doubts crept in. What's the point of all this Stoic stuff if it can't stop this kind of pain? But then he remembered Seneca's take on grief. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. Mike's loss was real, no question, but Jake's spiraling thoughts? Those were his own making. He couldn't bring Danny back or erase Mike's hurt. What he could do was show up, be there, and not let his own head make it worse than it already was. So he did. The next day, he brought Mike a six-pack and sat with him in silence. No big speeches, no fixing, just being there. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. And in that moment, Jake got it. Stoicism didn't promise a pain-free life. It promised a way to carry the pain without breaking. After Danny's funeral, life settled into a strange new normal. Mike started coming around again, quieter but still himself. Jake kept up his routine tire shop, side gigs, guitar practice, and something shifted. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building. One night, he sat down with his notebook and looked back at where he'd started. That curb outside his flooded apartment, feeling like the world had chewed him up and spit him out. Now, he had a job, a roof, a friend he'd stood by through the worst. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a life he'd made. Marcus Aurelius had a line that fit. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Jake wasn't happy every day. Some mornings still sucked. And the rent was still a stretch, but he'd learned to steer his mind away from the cliffs. When a customer snapped at him, he shrugged it off. When a gig fell through, he found another. When he missed Sarah, he let the feeling pass instead of chasing it. Carlos noticed it too. One day at the shop, he clapped Jake on the shoulder and said, "You're different, man. Used to look like you were carrying the world. Now you're just chill." Jake laughed. "Chill's one way to put it. Just figured out what I can handle and what I can't." That was the Stoic core. Control what you can, let go of what you can't, and keep moving. Jake wasn't a philosopher or a hero. He was a mechanic with a notebook and a beat-up guitar. but he'd built himself up from the ashes, one small, stubborn step at a time. Spring rolled into Denver, and with it came a shift Jake hadn't expected. The tire shop picked up warmer weather meant more road trips, more flats, more work. His boss finally bumped him to full-time, and the extra hours eased the rent squeeze. Jake even started stashing a few bucks away. Not much, but enough to feel like a cushion. For the first time in months, he wasn't just treading water, he was swimming. One Saturday, he was out on a side gig, fixing a busted alternator for a lady named Tara. She was in her late 30s, owned a little coffee shop downtown, and had a no-nonsense vibe Jake liked. While he worked under the hood, she leaned against her car, sipping an iced coffee and asking questions. Showed he'd get into mechanics. What was the worst car he'd ever fixed? It was easy conversation, the kind he hadn't had in a while. When he finished, she handed him cash and said, "You're good at this. Ever think about doing it full-time on your own?" Jake wiped his hands on a rag and shrugged. "Used to. Had big dreams about my own shop. Life had other plans." Tara nodded. "Yeah, it does that. But you're still here, right? Dreams don't have expiration dates." She drove off, and Jake stood there, her words rattling around in his head. He hadn't thought about that old dream in months, too busy keeping his head above water. But Tara's offhand comment lit a spark. Not a wildfire, just a flicker. Maybe he wasn't done yet. That night, he pulled out his notebook and jotted down a new idea. Save up, maybe take on more gigs, see if he could build something small, a mobile repair service, nothing fancy. It wasn't a plan set in stone, just a seed, but it felt good to plant it. Epictetus had said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." Jake wasn't ready to call himself a business owner, but he could start acting like one step at a time. And then there was Tara. She texted him a week later. Her car was making a weird noise. He fixed it, she paid him with coffee and a muffin, and they talked again. It wasn't a romance, not yet, but it was a connection, a reminder that life could still surprise him with something good. By the time summer hit, Jake could look back and see the road he'd traveled. It wasn't a straight line, more like a beat-up back road with potholes and detours. The shop closing, Sarah leaving, the flood, Mike's loss, they'd all left marks. But so had the small wins. The tire shop job, the cleaned-up apartment, the guitar chords, the extra cash in his pocket. One evening, he sat on his couch, still lumpy but dry now, and strummed that guitar. He'd gotten halfway decent, enough to play a shaky version of Sweet Home Alabama. Mike came over, cracked a beer, and clapped when he finished. "Not bad, man," Mike said. "You're like a whole new guy." Jake grinned. Same guy, just figured some stuff out. And he had. Stoicism wasn't magic, it didn't erase the hard stuff. But it gave him a framework. Focus on what you can control, let go of what you can't, and find strength in the doing. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." Jake wasn't arguing anymore. He was living it messy, imperfect but real. He thought about Carlos whistling through his shifts and Tara nudging him toward that old dream. He thought about Mike, still healing but laughing again. And he thought about himself, how he'd gone from that curb surrounded by wreckage to here, with a notebook full of plans and a guitar in his hands. When everything fell apart, he didn't just survive, he built himself up. Not into some perfect version of Jake, but into a guy who could take a hit and keep standing. That was the Stoic way, not running from the storm, but learning to walk through it. Summer stretched into August, and Jake found himself in a place he hadn't expected, not perfect, but solid. The tire shop was humming, his side gigs were steady, and he'd saved enough to buy a cheap toolbox for that mobile repair idea. Tara's coffee shop became a regular stop, sometimes for a fix-it job, sometimes just to chat. Mike was back to his old self mostly, and Carlos kept the shop lively with his whistling. Life wasn't a highlight reel, but it was his, and he was okay with that. One night he sat on his porch, newly patched up, with some scrap wood, and flipped through his notebook. It was almost full now, pages crammed with crossed-off tasks, random, thoughts, and a few terrible guitar tabs. He traced the journey, from that flooded curb to this quiet moment sipping a beer under a Colorado sky. The chaos hadn't disappeared, rent was still tight, and the future was still fuzzy, but he'd changed. Stoicism had been his guide. Not some high and mighty philosophy, but a gritty, practical tool. Epictetus taught him to let go of what he couldn't, control Sarah's choices, the shop closing, Danny's death. Seneca showed him how to face pain without drowning in it. Marcus Aurelius reminded him to focus on the now, not the what-ifs. Together, they turned a guy who thought he was done into a guy who could keep going. Jake strummed his guitar, the notes still wobbly but stronger than before. He thought about how it started, everything falling apart. The job, the girl, the home all gone in a blink. Back then, he'd felt like a punching bag. Now, he was the one throwing punches not at the world, but at his own doubts. When life hit, he hit back with action, not anger. He wasn't rich or famous. He didn't have all the answers. But he had this: a life he'd rebuilt, brick by brick, from the rubble. And that was enough. More than enough, it was his. As the stars popped out, overhead Jake smiled. The Stoics were right, you don't need the world to bend for you. You just need to stand tall when it doesn't. And he was standing taller than ever. So that's Jake's story, a regular guy who took the worst life could throw and turned it into something real. It's not about dodging the hard stuff, it's about building yourself up when it hits. That's what Stoicism does. It's not fancy words or ancient history. It's a way to live right here, right now, no matter what's falling apart around you. If you enjoyed this article, stay tuned, where we dig into stories like Jake's, analyze the wisdom of the Stoics, and figure out how to stay grounded in a chaotic world. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join me next time for more practical conversations about how to live better, one day at a time. Because when things fall apart, that's when you start building. See you next time.